In my observation, life seems to follow a little bit of a pattern. Whilst there is the unpredictability of life itself, people have been around the block long enough that we can begin to see and to pick out patterns in human behavior. You ever said, if I do this, I know this person's going to do this, right? There's something in human nature, we can pick out patterns here and there. That's why strategists in the business world earn so much money. That's why the greatest leaders are proactive rather than reactive. And whilst there is still the unpredictability, there are still the tried and tested formulas which say, if we do this, this will happen. And if this happens, we need to do this in order to ensure that this does not happen, right? Anybody's mind work like that? Maybe it's just mine, and I wish mine worked like that more than it actually does. But as we continue on in our journey through the story that changes everything, our journey through the scriptures as the written story of God, looking at how it all fits together and forms one story of redemption, readying us as the people of God, not only for the life to come, but life and life in all of its fullness here and now. Today we turn to the book of Daniel. And Claire has already read to us verses from Daniel 3 earlier in the service, verses which spoke of three young Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the stand which they took boldly for their faith and the price that they would pay for that as a result. However, what was deliberately left out of the reading was the end of the story. So let's read that together now, shall we? We'll see it on the screen up above me here. And if you're following along in your own Bibles, it's Daniel 3:24 to 30. And I'm just going to read it from the screen so that it's the exact same as what everybody else has got there. It says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, Weren't there three men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, Certainly, your majesty. He said, Look, I see four men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, lovely, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. That's a lot of Shadrach, Meshachs, and Abednegos, isn't it? Right? But you see, with God, with our God, the story never ends the way that the world thinks it should. With our God, the story never ends the way that the world thinks it should. Now, as we unpack together the scriptures this morning, seeking God for their meaning and also how these words of the living word of the living God apply to us as his living people here in East Belfast this morning, we're going to consider three things together. Things which form a pattern, which play out not only in Daniel 3, but also throughout the scriptures, whenever the people of God are forced to make a decision between social inclusion and their God. And I would boldly say that it's not just related to the scriptures, but also to our everyday lives as well. Firstly, we'll look at the refusal. Then we'll look at the furnace, and then we'll look at the acknowledgement together. So that's our plan of action. Does that sound like a plan we can get on board with? Come on, Pam, just nod. Yeah, wonderful. I look to Pam. Pam's a good gauge. Aye, brilliant. Right, so let's start with the refusal. The three men that we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not born with these names initially. But being carried into Babylonian captivity, they were forced by King Nebuchadnezzar to change their names to assimilate them into Babylonian culture. So these are actually their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And along with Daniel, whose name was changed to Belteshazzar, get this, right? I've been practicing all week. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were forced to change their names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Do not go and listen to that on the YouVersion Bible app because it will sound different than what I just said, okay? But you get credit for trying, right? I'll be honest, I don't know which are easier to correctly pronounce. Their Jewish names or their new Babylonian names. Probably Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because we know it and we were taught it in Sunday school for those of us who went, right? And I'll be honest, I just don't know which one's easier to pronounce. But yet, since they were to be trained for 3 years and then enter into service of the king, the need for Babylonian names was something on which the king would come to insist. Not just in order to save face before his own people, but in an attempt to show these young men where their true allegiance was to lie. The only problem was that these young fellas didn't get the memo. They didn't get the memo. You see, what transpires is that King Nebuchadnezzar orders the building of a 90 feet high and 90 feet wide, 90 by 9 feet high gold statue of himself. It would be set up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon, and that would mean that it would be seen for miles on end from every conceivable direction. No matter where you looked, no matter which angle you looked from, if you looked at the plains of Dura, a prominent plain in Babylon, you would see this high and wide statue of gold, with each and every person of each and every social class expected to fall down and worship it at the sound of horn, flute, cedar, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music. We would have been exhausted on Friday, right? If we were out at the bands, we would have been exhausted, because every time you heard a flute, you'd have had to get down, right? The punishment for not doing that was, the punishment for non-conformity to command was very simple. The individual would be thrown into a blazing or a fiery furnace. Perhaps you know how the story goes. The three young men, they refuse to bow down, and for a while at least they get away with it. That is until a group of Chaldeans, those astrologers, make it known to the king that these three men are not conforming to the unilateral decree that had been made. It was unilateral in the sense that it applied to everybody. There was to be no exceptions at all. There's no doubt here, by the way, that there's political power at play by these Chaldeans, these men who were affronted and quite frankly put out that Jews who had been brought into captivity had been allowed to climb so high within the political offices of their nation. How on earth could this be allowed to happen? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they'd not made a public spectacle of their refusal. They didn't call a press conference and say, we're not going to do this. They didn't call a rally to really gee up the people and to say, we're not going to do this and you should join us. They didn't do anything like that. They didn't make a public spectacle of their refusal. But they also didn't attempt to hide the fact that their loyalty lay not with King Nebuchadnezzar, but with the King of Israel, with the God of Israel, God himself. Remember what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5? Something about a city on a hill not being able to be hidden. These guys knew that their act of defiance would not be hidden forever, and they didn't necessarily care. But they weren't going to make a public spectacle of the whole thing. Their refusal, as we said, was not going to go under the radar forever, and they were intelligent, trained men. They knew that all of this would come to a head sooner rather than later. Yet despite the cost, they still chose the God of Israel over an easy life. They probably could have rationalized it. Anybody here good at rationalizing things in their head, right? You know, I can do it, but I'll not mean it. I could just, if I hear a flute, I'll drop to the floor, but it'll not mean anything. It's about what goes on in here rather than what goes on out here. We could try and rationalize it, but these guys didn't. These guys didn't try and rationalize it, and I think there's a lesson for each one of us there. That rationalization, that us convincing ourselves that something's okay because, well, I don't really mean it, that's a great tactic of the enemy to get us to bow to him and to his ways rather than to take a stand for God. But they chose not to do that. They chose not to do that. They chose the God of Israel. They chose their God over an easy life. And you can imagine the anger of the king, can't you? You have to hold a very high level of self-importance to command the building of a 90 by 9 feet golden statue of yourself to be put on a hill that everybody could see. So you can imagine the rage that must have been felt on his part whenever 3 young Jews who, in his eyes, he has taken from the destitution of their own land, loved and trained in his land, and promoted to high positions of authority within his country and his kingdom. You can imagine the anger when these boys refuse to comply with what he would see as a very reasonable command. The king would have also been aware of the need for him to not come across as weak whenever he was dealing with them. And he demands an answer. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are before him. The Chaldeans, we're not told that they leave, so it's highly likely that they're there. And all of the king's officials will have been around as well. And the king summons them and he demands answers. And he really doesn't like the answer that he gets. You ever got on your high horse before? I know how you have, right? And you say something to somebody and they reply not with a sorry, but with a, well, actually. It's not nice, is it? Right? But this is what happens here. The king, the most powerful man in the land, probably, scholars argue about this, but probably the most powerful man in the known world at the time, demands an answer from these 3 young men, and the response he receives is not the one that he anticipates. We're told in verses 16 to 18 that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image which you have set up." If I had a mic, I'd do that. But mics are expensive, and I'm not going to drop one to the floor. This is a real mic drop moment. Can you imagine the response? Can you imagine you are one of the crowd that have gathered round to hear this in the king's chamber? The king is being very reasonable, right? Or so it seems. He's being very reasonable. And the cheek of these 3 boys, they're not even one of us. What right do they have to talk to him like that? These boys were not messing about. And as the people of God, neither should we. Right? Notice that they knew that God could save them, but they were not arrogant enough to presume that he would. They knew that God could, But they also weren't arrogant enough to presume that God would do what they wanted him to do. They knew his ability, but they did not presume that they knew God's will. They knew God's ability, but they did not presume that they knew God's will. Do you remember Job? The story of Job in the Bible, the book of Job? We haven't looked at it yet. I'll be honest, I've kind of been avoiding it, but we will get there. The book of Job, where Job, who's been going through and enduring many trials that are unthinkable, he turns and he says, though he, that is God, though he slay me, yet I will trust him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not presume to know what the will of God was, but they knew what he could do. They knew his ability. And God has clearly laid out his commands for us in his word. He's clearly laid them out. There will be people, there will be politicians, governments, friends, foes, mentors, gurus, even family members who demand that we live in a certain way or that we do certain things. That people or possessions or concepts or laws are given prominence in our lives, and that we conform without question and without query. Yet as the people of God, true authority in our lives ought not to lie with the demands of others or of governments or of even our own self-desires and self-indulgence. True authority in our lives must lie with God and the commands which he has laid out in his written word. I would repeat that, but it's quite long, right? But it's important. This is the authority of our lives. This is not just a book. This is the living word of the living God for us, his living people. Passed down from generation to generation. That's why the Jewish nation puts such emphasis on passing down. And as we journey through the Psalms this week, you will see a number of different Psalms where the psalmist talks about passing down the knowledge of God from generation to generation. For telling the story, sharing the stories, and of building lives upon the written word. Why? Because the word became flesh and dwelt among us. Because the word took on flesh in Jesus Christ and laid down his life so that we could be free. It's not just words on a page. It's the salvation of the world. And contained within it are all things required to live a life that is pleasing to God. And contained within it are all the commands in order that we might do that. Not bound as slaves, but living in freedom and enjoying life, and life in all of its fullness. You see, issues raise their head and then they fall into the background. Kingdoms and governments and politicians, they rise, and then as soon as they've risen, they fall again. People come and go. But the word of the Lord endures forever. So let's not chase cheap thrills and easy wins. Let's not chase popularity and a desire to be liked and accepted. Because when we do that, we run the risk of turning our backs on the God who loves, redeems, and saves. After all, as Jesus said, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or, as the King James says, what does it profit a man to gain the world but lose their very soul? What does it profit? See, nonconformity is hard. It's hard. Who here has ever experienced peer pressure? I'm not just talking about drinking and smoking and all that sort of stuff. If our hands haven't been in the air, they've been in the air in our heads, right? We've all experienced peer pressure in some way, shape, or form. And I want to tell you, I know nonconformity is hard, and taking a stand can be isolating, and it can be really difficult, and it can even make us question if it's even worth it at all. I get it. I've lost friends over that. And when I lost my friends, it broke my heart and it left me feeling isolated. But the Lord is always worth it. He is always worth it. There will be times whenever we, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, will have to say, do you know what? I do not need to defend myself before you in this matter. Now, we'll probably not use those words because we don't tend to talk like that, do we? But we may have to take a stand and say, I don't have to defend my actions to you. I don't need to give an explanation as to why. See when somebody comes up against you, and see when somebody makes false accusations, and see whenever somebody says something that's not quite true, we want to just jump in and correct them, don't we? We want to just jump in and we want to correct them, and it's so hard, especially on social media. It's so hard to just bite your tongue and say, do you know what? It doesn't matter. I don't owe you an explanation. I don't have to defend myself before you in this matter. And take a stand for what we believe to be true, knowing that God is good, knowing that God is just, and that God is our vindicator. I'm loving this journey through the Psalms. I'm a wee bit further ahead than you are, obviously, having written the devotions for them. But I love that God reveals himself to be the avenger. The superhero fan in me just jumps for joy, right? I am your avenger. I am your vindicator. In other words, leave it to me. Leave it to me. My dad has this wonderful saying. I've shared it with some of you before. He says, son, don't worry. The Lord will get them in the long grass. Right? And there's something quite comforting about that. Whenever we feel defensive, and whenever we feel that we need to defend ourselves, whenever we take a stand, know that he is the avenger, that he is the vindicator, that he is just, that he is good. And in so giving this offering of praise to him, the Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. It's consistent with his nature. It's who he is. And the reward might look different than we expect, and we might not recognize it at first. But he will never leave those who take a stand for him up a creek without a paddle. He'll never leave us on our own. He'll never leave us defenseless. He will always come through. So that's the refusal. And I better get my skates on because I made you a promise before the Lord. We'll move to the furnace. These 2 points are shorter. I made that joke knowing I would be fine. King Nebuchadnezzar then is spitting feathers at their defiance. You ever been so angry? Right? You know, the old cartoons. I love the Scooby-Doo cartoons because like the smoke comes out the ears and all. You remember those? Right? There's smoke coming from his ears right now. He is spitting feathers. He is raging. He's not one bit happy. And worse than that, they've insulted him in front of his officials and in front of the Chaldeans. He orders that the furnace be their destiny, but that the furnace be 7 times hotter than it usually is. 7 times hotter than it usually is. I haven't been to a bonfire in years, right? But those things are hot, even whenever you're well back. Even whenever you're well back. But this furnace was to be hotter than a bonfire, and then 7 times hotter than that again. Such was the rage of the king. He commands that they were to be bound in their coats and thrown in. In fact, he gets his strongest men, we're told, to make sure that there's no way that they can get out, that there's no means of escape, and that their death, therefore, would be quick, and their death would be complete. So they're never going to step outside of that furnace ever again. Now, this is a wee side note, but I think it's important here to note that the boys, I call them boys, they were men. The men were not disrespectful in their tone towards the king. There's no disrespect there. They were not blasé or casual about their objection, but they were matter of fact, and they were respectful in the way that they conveyed it. The change in which the writer portrays the king's change of tone here suggests that he had previously tried to reason with them. His tone was a reasonable tone, trying to reason with them, much as one commentator says, as a father does with a son who has been out of line. But he's now left exasperated and incensed at their refusal to be wooed by his attempted reasoning with them. And I think there's a lesson for us here too, as the people of God, in light of what we've already spoken about this morning, and it is this, that there is a difference between honor and obedience. Had the three men obeyed the king, they would not have been thrown into the fire, but they would have disobeyed God. Yet in their response, they honored the king, addressing him appropriately and giving him his rightful place. They called him Your Majesty on a number of occasions. Yet they honored and obeyed the rightful place of the King of Kings in their lives. You see, as we take a stand for God, it is important that we honor those whom we disobey in doing so. And that we don't mistake disobedience for dishonor. Okay? So let's know that there is a difference here. There is a difference between honoring and disobeying. If I did everything my father told me to do, Chloe would be one unhappy wife. All right? But I sometimes disobey that which my father asks me to do, but I still honor him. I don't disrespect him in not doing these things. It's important the way that we conduct ourselves as we take a stand. We need to take a stand honoring God, but also honoring those whom we disobey in doing so as well. You know the story. We've read it. They're thrown into the furnace that's 7 times hotter. The men who took them, they're consumed by the flames, and they're not even in it. It's super hot, hotter than we can probably comprehend. And then King Nebuchadnezzar goes to check up, to get an update. Wonder how it's going. And he goes, here, there's 4 of them. Did we not throw 3 in? Did we not throw 3 of them in? You can imagine the disarray. You can imagine just the delusionment. You can imagine just how he's so bewildered. He's going, have we made a mistake here? Why is there 4 of those? I only commanded that 3 of them be thrown in. And the officials confirmed, no, we only threw 3 in. Well, then why are 4 of them walking in around there unbounded and unharmed? Why is this happening, and what does this have to say to us? You see, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego took a stand for God, as they paid the consequence of taking that stand, and we need to know that Jesus said for a reason, take up your cross daily and follow me. Following Jesus was never supposed to be easy, folks. And I wonder if in Western Christianity we've made it this, let's say a prayer and everything will be all right. When actually, in reality, following Jesus costs us stuff. And we're not just talking money. It costs us stuff. And there was a cost to be paid, a price to be paid that day as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego took the stand. And they were thrown into this furnace. As they were paying the consequences of their stand, of their placing publicly their faith in God, what happened? God got into the furnace with them. Right? God got into the furnace with them. Commentators believe that this is a physical embodiment in the Old Testament of Jesus himself. That Jesus himself gets into the furnace with them. As we take a stand, there will be earthly consequences. But as we find ourselves in the furnace, whatever that looks like, be that unpopularity, be that a loss of employment, be that a loss of friendship, be that a loss of something, be that whatever it is, know this, that whenever you find yourself in the consequences of your action of standing, God stands there right with you. and he will not let a hair on your head be harmed, which for some of us is easier than others, but he will not let you be brought to ruin. I love that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not assume that God would do this, but they knew that he could. And it is so consistent with his nature that Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, the God who was in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that he will stand with us in the furnaces of our lives. It's important that we take a stand. It's important that we know that the stand comes with consequences. But how does that pattern end? That pattern ends with acknowledgement. Did you notice that King Nebuchadnezzar recognized that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was the only God who could have possibly done this? Why? Because he is the one true God. King Nebuchadnezzar maybe didn't realize that at the time, but he recognized that God was the only one who could possibly do this. You see, as we take a stand, people begin to notice. We see this played out in Scripture so many times, but particularly we see it in the book of Acts. As the people of God took a stand for him, people stood in awe and amazement, and many more came to the faith. Yes, there were those who scorned, there were those who laughed, there were those who persecuted them even to the point of death, but there were those who acknowledged, there were those who recognized that God was the only one who could, that God is the only one who can, and that God is the only one who will. So folks, this morning, there's so much more I could say, but it is past, and I made you a promise, and I think that's important that we see that promise through. But know this, that as we take a stand, and as we pay the cost, that our God stands right there with us. And there's an old phrase, and it goes like this, that we might be the only Bible that certain people ever read. So we need to make our story a good one. And we need to make it true to the Word of God. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we could do another one on this some other time. But for now, I'm going to invite the band to come. And they're going to lead us in our closing song of worship. All I once held dear, knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best. My joy, my righteousness. And I love you, Lord. May this be a prayer of our hearts as we take a stand in our lives for him. Let's stand together.